On the bench, I've got my Pentax MZ-3 with the body panels fully removed and ready for further disassembly. The first stage is desoldering this part of the flex circuit from the rest of the camera. And once it's sufficiently disconnected, I can lift it up and get access to the flash capacitors and remove those as well. I'm primarily going to be working on the right side or the grip side of the camera because I really only need to free up one side of the mirror box. I'm not actually going to remove it completely. I'm just going to kind of rotate it out and away from the camera chassis while leaving the left side connected. As you'll see, this repair involves quite a bit of soldering already, and completely detaching the left side of the mirror box adds a heck of a lot more soldering. The first few connections were power and ground wires from the battery, and these two tabs are for the panorama switch. Yeah, this camera has a cheesy crop mode panorama switch because apparently the camera industry went absolutely panorama crazy in the 1990s. I guess it's all photo dads wanted, and you couldn't really sell a camera without panorama mode. And then I have these 4 posts connecting the flex circuit to the flash capacitor PCB, which is the green bit sticking out underneath. I try to move quickly on most of these connections because lingering too long increases my chances of damaging the flex circuit. It's not nearly as heat resistant as a traditional fiberglass printed circuit board is. Next is this little bundle of wires. When I first started doing this repair, obviously I took a lot of photos so I could remember how this stuff went back together, but I think I'm in the dozens now in terms of MZ cameras repaired. And I'm almost to the point where I don't need to reference anything while I'm doing the repair. I can just get in there and go. But this is one area that I still have to kind of pause and question which wire goes where. So this portion of the flex circuit is mounted on a plastic carrier, which helps support some of the physical contacts for the top cover. And this screw holds that plastic carrier down to the chassis. Got to remove that before I can lift it. I'm going to take one last look at these connection tabs. The sucker usually does a good job, but it can leave small amounts of solder behind, which is enough to hold the connection together and keep it from separating. So I'm just pulling the tabs back to make sure I have a complete disconnect. All right, now to lift this flex circuit. It takes some finesse. Well, maybe gentle hackery is a better term. I like to start near the shutter release, get my tweezers underneath the plastic carrier, and then pry it up. And once that first part is free, I have to check the posts to the flash PCB again. Like I said earlier, there's usually some solder left behind, which keeps the flex from pulling away cleanly. And what I'm doing is applying some gentle upward pressure while touching off on each of the posts to loosen any remaining solder. And eventually, yeah, there we go. The flex will lift away. Now I can see the flash capacitor PCB, and I've just got one wire and a couple screws to remove that. This is the part where it's really important to have properly discharged the capacitors. See part 1 in this video series, because it's easy to short the wrong connections and give yourself a nice jump scare. The capacitors are often held in place with some double-sided tape, but these feel pretty loose. If they are taped, I'll dribble some isopropyl alcohol underneath the capacitor and help them release more easily. In this case, I just have the double-sided tape holding this flex cable, and even that is already loose. And yeah, they just slip right out. The depth of field preview switch is hanging out here. Just need to remove one screw, and this stays attached and just kind of dangles around on the end of its flex cable. I've got to break out the solder sucker again for this flex connection above the lens mount. These are the lines that go to the shutter and control the timing. Again, the strategy is to remove most of the solder from each of the connections and then pull gently while touching off with the soldering iron. The bottom part of the connection is secured with double-sided tape to the housing and usually requires a little extra work to get free. I'll go back to the isopropyl alcohol and let that loosen it. Man, this one is really stubborn. I applied isopropyl alcohol a couple more times and let it soak, and still slowly working my tweezers under there. In real time, this actually took me a few minutes to get free, but I don't want to make you sit through that. It doesn't make for good TV. This flex cable on the bottom plate doesn't need to be disconnected, it just loosened up, so I pop it off its posts and gives me enough slack to work. And now I can start going after the screws that actually hold the mirror box in place. There are a couple down here connecting it to the bottom plate. I'll remove those first. The eyepiece here isn't connected to the mirror box, but it is hiding two of the screws that I need to get to, so I do need to remove that. This one looks to be in pretty good shape. Sometimes these can get nasty and fungusy if the camera's been sitting in a closet for too long. And these three screws on the back are the main attachment points for the mirror box, as they attach directly to the chassis and consequently to the film plane. Oh, and I missed one on the front of the camera, so I'll take care of that real quick. And now I'm gonna start feeling this thing out. There are a couple posts that extend from the bottom of the mirror box down into the bottom plate. So the first movement I have to make is to push the mirror box up towards the top of the camera. And then once it's clear of the bottom plate, it can be rotated out. When I first learned to do this repair, I would also take the bottom plate off, just completely off. And it's more tedious, there's more parts to remove, but it makes removing the mirror box a lot easier. And maybe more significantly, it makes putting the mirror box back in easier. Now that I have a feel of how the camera goes together, I'm much more comfortable just doing the repair with the bottom plate in place. And it looks like I forgot to disconnect the speaker wires before I pulled the mirror box, so I'll do that real quick. And here is the almost fully removed mirror box. One important thing to look for at this point are thin copper washers at the 3 mount points on the back of the camera. They are shims, and they are used to ensure the distance and parallelism between the lens mount and the film plane are accurate. Not all cameras have them. Some do, some don't. They were just applied as needed in the factory. And if any are present, they need to be reinstalled in the same positions you find them. Now that I have access to the side of the mirror box, I can remove the aperture control block and get at the mechanisms underneath, which is where the majority of problems are found in these cameras. You can now clearly see the motor on the upper right and how its drive shaft protrudes through the plate. The failed gear we're after is mounted on that drive shaft. Before I remove the motor, I want to desolder the positive and negative leads. And then it's just 2 screws and it's out. In the next video, I'll install a new gear on the motor before reinstalling. And here's where all the business happens during an exposure. These are the mechanisms that run most of the core functions of the camera. They control the aperture, they charge the shutter, they move the mirror up and down. The mirror motor, which I just removed, meshes with this gray gear in the upper right. It first goes through a gear train to achieve sufficient reduction, and then it's turning these yellow and green gears. And those 2 gears actually have cam profiles on the back of them, which we'll look at next time. And those move the shutter charging lever and the mirror drive lever during an exposure cycle. So in the next video, I'm gonna take all this out. I'm gonna inspect all the parts in this assembly more closely. I'm gonna share how I make replacement parts for this camera, and then we'll start putting it back together. All right, cheers.